I have been looking for an opportunity for quite some time to have someone on this podcast to share some time with a person I've known for a very, very long time. He's not just the way you folks got to know me, the way I generally like my guests. He's not just extremely bright and fabulous conversationalist. He's also a courageous person, very brave man who has mentored, inspired a number of people who need people like Professor Chris Wells very, very much. Professor Kristopher Wells is at MacEwan University. He's a Canada Research Chair studying all things related to LGBT youth. And Dr. Wells, I should say, unfortunately, because of things that go on in our society, opportunities do present themselves. But I'm so glad to have access to you.
Oh, thank you. And thanks for that warm bio. I'm going to make sure my mom tunes in to listen to that. So,
well, before we do anything else, I want you to talk a little bit about the Pride tape and the Pride tape issue, because you and your crew in Edmonton have a lot to do with Pride tape and the fact that we know anything about Pride tape in the first place.
Yeah. We were really privileged to be able to create Pride Tape here in Edmonton, and with strong support from the Edmonton Oilers. But Pride Tape really emerged from a research question we had when we were looking at the experiences of LGBTQ youth, and particularly young gay and bisexual boys. They were dropping out of organized team sports at earlier and earlier ages than their heterosexual peers, and really it was the culture of the locker room, the kind of homophobic language that they were continually exposed to, that made them feel that the game that they loved was not safe for them, and so they would drop out. And so Pride Tape really, was many creative minds who were involved in this, was designed to be an intervention into that homophobic locker room, to say to these young players that there's someone here who supports you, who believes in you, and will welcome you into the game that you love. And so, once we had designed the concept of Pride Tape, is we took it to the then captain of the Edmonton Oilers, Andrew Ference, who we had previously worked with, and who was actually, a fun story here, he became the first team captain of any professional sport in North America to march in a Pride parade, and it was here in Edmonton. And so when we had this concept of the Pride Tape, Andrew told us two really important things. He said, number one, you're going to have to work with the NHL, because you'll never get support if you don't include them from the very beginning. And number two, he said, you can't expect everybody to use the tape if you create it, because hockey players are superstitious, and they're not going to use the tape if they're used to taping their stick in a certain ways. But for us, it was always important that it was optional, because we wanted people to sticks and be true allies. We didn't want false allies and somebody who felt they just had to do it because everybody else was doing it. And to this day, when we launched Pride Tape with the Edmonton Oilers in their skills competition for their fans, it's now blossomed to be used by all 32 teams in the National Hockey League. In fact, the first stick that was used by the Edmonton Oilers with Pride Tape sits in the Hockey Hall of Fame. So, and then it's gone worldwide, to be used in many other sports and in many other countries.
Should we assure people here and now, because I realize that there's always a lot of skepticism, even cynicism out there. Should we assure people, Dr. Wells, that the Pride Tape has all of the same properties as traditional hockey tape, same adhesion, same texture, same good stuff?
Yeah, well, and that's another thing Andrew Ference told us. He said, you have to make a pro product. Players aren't going to use something, right, that is inferior. And so we actually went to the hockey tape manufacturers with the idea of Pride Tape. First thing they told us was it can't be done. Nobody's ever put 6 colors on one roll of tape. And of course, we found out quickly that you can't just get 100 rolls made. You had to get 10,000 rolls made. And so we did a Kickstarter campaign to involve the community. And we had, small $5, $10 donations come from people all over the world to make Pride Tape a reality. And the very last donation to put us over the Kickstarter goal and to make all this happen came from the Burke family, in honor of Brendan Burke, who had tragically passed away in a car accident. So it was really poignant from day one. The Burke family and many of our hockey greats all were behind the idea of Pride Tape and wanted to see it, become a reality.
So my first take when Gary Bettman, commissioner of the National Hockey League, turned thumbs down on Pride Tape, banned players from using it, banned teams. I just thought, how small is that? I mean, I was aware of the controversy of DeSantis, the governor in Florida, and all the hay and the dough he's made on homophobia. And I mean, I get all that. I didn't have a trouble understanding where the reactionary business was coming from, but I didn't think that the National Hockey League would just cower and submit to that. Were you as surprised as I was that they did?
Yeah, I'm very surprised, deeply, disappointed by the decision. We had seen earlier the Pride and other special cause jerseys be banned, but Pride Tape was different than that because it was always optional and no player was required to use it. So this really came out of a bit out of nowhere because no one was even talking about this, and particularly when the original argument from the NHL was that these jerseys and these special cause nights were causing a distraction by focusing on the players who weren't using them rather than the 95% of the players who were. That there wasn't a problem to be addressed here, and it really turned into the controversy that they were trying to prevent in the first place.
But of course, the response, it wasn't about the 5 players. The response was about the vicious political campaign that many social conservatives. I mean, I use DeSantis because he's the one who's best known, but unfortunately, it's not just DeSantis, but it's basically social conservative Republicans. They set their hair on fire every time any kind of campaign like this exists. My guess is, I'm guessing here, that if the National Football League were to try anything like this, I mean, imagine Pride footballs, for instance. I think that there would be an uproar from the far right.
Yeah, I think you're right, and your earlier show with Bruce Arthur really, you both did a fantastic job in the analysis of what is really happening here, and we're seeing this as being part of a larger trend in society that's targeting the LGBT community and trying to silence and erase its very visibility and its existence. So, we look at this as a kind of enforced invisibility that the NHL is doing here. And who's it hurt the most, right? If you're a gay NHL hockey player right now and you were thinking of coming out, well, forget about it, right? This has just sent you a message to go back into the closet, and really is the opposite of what hockey has been trying to do in terms of grow diversity and grow the game and invite more people into the sport.
It's just, I don't mean to sound like a naive Pollyanna, but it distresses me that one of the communities that is the most threatened, especially around the world. I mean, I'm not saying that it's not an issue in Canada and the States, of course it is, but the LGBT community in places like Turkey and Iran and many countries around the world, Russia, many others, is the most threatened. And so the idea that the LGBT, according to social conservatives, the idea that the LGBT community is threatening to anybody is absurd.
Well, we still see 60 plus countries in the world where being an LGBTQ person is considered a crime, and several countries where that is punishable by death. And we're seeing this global rise of populism and right-wing extremism. And unfortunately, it's the LGBT community that is becoming the target and the scapegoat. We're seeing similar conservative political rhetoric, here in Canada with, the battle over pronouns and LGBTQ inclusion in schools in New Brunswick, and how far-reaching it goes, where Premier Scott Moe is even on course to use the notwithstanding clause to exempt the government out of basic human rights protections here. And that is itself unprecedented. We've never seen a government in Canada use the notwithstanding clause that targets vulnerable young people in our society.
So the talking point that I constantly hear from social conservatives I know is that, Chuck, you just don't understand. Parents have a right to know everything about their kids, and we don't want the LGBT community to create a separation from sons and daughters and parents. And the LGBT community is getting involved in the school system to create that kind of friction and separation. What does Dr. Kristopher Wells have to say about that?
Well, this whole notion of so-called parental rights has been around, a long time. And in fact, here in Canada, we can go back to the 1970s when Anita Bryant brought her "Save Our Children" a crusade into Canada and onto the prairies. In fact, even making a stop here in Edmonton with this slogan that since gays can't reproduce, they have to recruit. That somehow they're predators, they're coming after vulnerable children. We have to sort of rescind any human rights protections or non-discrimination ordinances. We have to root them out of public occupations such as education or policing. Really was a form of a purge, right? This moral panic that's happened. And here we are again today. The language has changed now, right? Anybody who supports LGBTQ rights is a groomer, right? And this notion that somehow even talking about LGBTQ issues in our society or showing signs of support will, recruit young people who are impressionable and vulnerable into this deviant, sinister lifestyle. So you can see how incredible these and ludicrous these stereotypes are. But we knew after same-sex marriage was legalized in Canada in 2005, schools would be the next battleground for this so-called culture war, because, right, schools are at the heart of every community, and schools are the future of every community and our society. And so what gets taught in schools matters a lot, because this is where we produce responsible and respectful citizens. So it's no surprise to me that we're seeing these groups, these Million Man marches, not only target, transgender youth and pronouns, they're targeting school materials that are LGBTQ inclusive. They're targeting any school that celebrates Pride Week or raises a Pride flag. It's just really scary to see what's happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, over the many years, I've done this for over half a century now. So whether it's civil rights or women's rights or workers' rights or LGBT rights, I'm always on the side of people who are being marginalized, and I want them to have the same rights that everyone else has. I never in a million years thought that would get me to be called a groomer. And because I've been called all kinds of names for various reasons, depending on what my perspective was, I get used to it. So to me, it's just, water off a duck's back. I get called another stupid name, whatever. But I just wonder, Chris Wells, for people who don't do what I do for a living, but they are influencers in their communities, are they prevented from, do they hesitate to join you because they don't want to be called a name? They don't want to have that label.
Oh, absolutely. And people ask often me, well, like, why are you so prominently featured in the media when it comes to LGBTQ issues? And part of that is I have academic freedom, which protects me from being fired from my job, but also because the moment anybody else speaks out, they get inundated with such hate and discrimination, and people go after their employers, or they start targeting where they live. They get doxxed online, that the moment they pop up and speak out, then they disappear because it's not safe for them. Even myself, even around this Pride tape controversy from the NHL, every time that happens, my inbox and my phone line get inundated with hate. And sometimes that hate is so extreme that I have to call the Edmonton Police Services Hate Crimes Unit to investigate.
So I want to discuss some of the larger issues, but before we do that, just to stay with some of the events in the news, I don't know whether they're going to be calling it a Million Man March, but it's the same thing, the same organizations involved in the same sort of activities. Have we got another one of those coming up in the next couple of days? We're recording this on a Wednesday, October 18th. So just so everyone has some perspective on that. In the next few days, are we going to be confronting this again, Dr. Wells, in Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. We've heard many plans across the country to keep these, which are really illegal marches, right? They're never taking out actually a permit anywhere in a city. They're never paying the costs for police protection, which, of course, when we host a pride parade, right? It's tens of thousands of dollars in city permits and having the police involved to close streets and direct traffic. So there's a real inequity here also in policing that is not being addressed, that now anybody can just have an illegal protest and show up and take over the streets of a community, make people feel unsafe, and there are very little repercussions for that. And that's part of this tactic, is to keep having these kinds of marches and these protests to make people feel vulnerable and unsafe in their communities, and to wear people down, right? And to say like, oh, well, we can't keep counter protesting, everything all of the time.
It amazes me because on the one hand, it doesn't really matter what part of the country I've lived in. I've lived in every part of the country. The way I look at this, every family knows somebody. So some families have several people in their families who are teachers, like yourself. It doesn't matter to me whether it's at a university level, high school, elementary school, middle school. It doesn't matter. Everyone knows teachers. Everyone has teachers somewhere in the family tree. It amazes me that these Million Man March folks, and many of them are the exact same folks who do convoy, anti-vax, a number of other right of center causes, same crowd. This is how they keep themselves busy, and of course, it does raise a lot of money. But when we're talking about this, it amazes me that they make any headway at all, because I just don't think anybody with a teacher in the family is thinking, that Aunt Sally or Uncle Bill are groomers, are pedophiles, are trying to encourage trying to encourage children to do things to their bodies. I mean, you hear certain advocates on the right talking about how teachers are now encouraging children to, cut off. I hate to use this language, but this is the language that they use to get people all whipped up in a frenzy, to cut off their genitals. I mean, you would think that there'd be resistance to this from parents who simply know teachers and know that that is not why a teacher gets out of bed in the morning and goes to school. There are many things that teachers are all about. That's not what they're about.
I started my career as a classroom teacher, and in fact, it was working in schools and then in the community alongside LGBTQ youth that sent me back to university and graduate studies to figure out how to create safer and more inclusive school environments for them, and also for teachers. And this false narrative that teachers are somehow keeping secrets from parents. At the end of the day, all a parent ever has to do is ask their child, and if their child feels safe and the quality of the relationship is supportive, well, they'll be happy to share their realities and their thoughts. But in many cases, we know that coming out can still place a child at extreme risk. The research shows us that upwards here, in Canada, anywhere between 20 to 40% of all street-involved young people are somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum. And that's often because, their families have failed to support them. And then, if your family's not a safe place, where do you go? Well, you go to school. But if your school's not a safe place, what's left for you? And too often, the answer there is the streets. And we know that it's a lot harder to get a kid off the street than to prevent them from being on the street in the first place. So all of these major social institutions in their lives have broken down and failed to support them. That's all anybody wants, is these kids to be themselves and to find, support in their communities.
Well, when you hear the language and you hear the tone, I actually ask myself the question, so what if I'm 14 years old and my parents are doing this stuff, are involved in this kind of activity? If I'm 14 years old and I've got a gender issue that I need to discuss, the last people in the world I'm going to discuss it with are my folks. I'm sorry, but I don't know how else to look at it.
There's an author who uses the phrase 5 seconds of bigotry, right? That I'll give you the example. So your mom, dad, son, daughter sitting around the television over after dinner, with the cat and the dog, the quintessential North American family, and then they're flipping through television and dad has the remote because dad always has the remote. And on comes, RuPaul's Drag Race or Will and Grace or a show like that. And, dad says, well, look at those faggots, and turns the channel. Now, within that span of less than 5 seconds, that parent has just signaled to their child that they're not safe to have any conversation about sexual and gender diversity with. right? So it's these small little moments that can create these environments that have a huge impact on young people in terms of their safety and well-being.
So I guess it's fair to say when you hear the rhetoric at these marches, it shouldn't take an Einstein to figure out why some kids have trouble speaking to their parents about these things.
Well, what we really noticed is this rhetoric is getting a lot more violent and a lot more extreme and dangerous, right? Here you are just a couple of days ago seeing students in Saskatchewan walk out of school to protest kinds of policies. So I think we also see a real generational divide happening here, whether we're talking about the pride tape ban in the NHL with an older generation of white heterosexual owners and a younger generation of players who've grown up in a world surrounded by sexual and gender diversity. They have friends or family members from this community that they care about. But, you know, those who have the power, whether it's the politicians or the owners versus, right, those who are impacted the most by the decisions. So to me, at the end of the day, it really shows that how much more education needs to happen and starting early and often in our school system.
What's the central message that you have for people who are thinking of, say, using a pride tape on their hockey sticks? Well, what is the message that they are sending?
Well, we have this saying at Pride Tape and our small little grassroots collective is we make tape and you make it powerful, right? Like it's really the power in Pride Tape is not, you know, the tape on the stick. It's the conversation that it engenders, because it's through the conversation that is the possibility for change to actually happen.
Is it fair to say, or unfair? The way I look at these things is, you know, equality is, you know, it's to me it's not an option. I see Canada as the Adler family's promised land. I've said that on the podcast before. That's simply historically accurate based on my own history with my own family, what this country means to us. This country gave us the opportunity to be equal. So being equal is a very big thing with me. But I don't like this notion of their team and our team and whatever. I call me, you know, a little bit altruistic, but I think all of us are on the same team. The team is called humanity. That's what Pride Tape says to me, Chris Wells.
Well, and here we are in Canada, right? Canada is known often for two great things all over the world, hockey and human rights. And, you know, Pride Tape brings them really together in one powerful symbol. But I think all of us should be very concerned about what we're seeing, whether it's banning, you know, Pride Tape or these Million Man marches or people protesting against drag queen story time. It's about pitting our communities against each other, right? And today it's targeting the LGBT community, but tomorrow it might be targeting your community and the people that, you know, you care about and you love. Because democracy is stronger when we're all together and when we're not only understanding our differences, but we come to a point where we celebrate them as one of our greatest strengths.
Do you think this gets to a point where some people who feel education is being targeted, do you feel there are some people, or do you hear from people who say, you know, I was thinking about becoming a teacher, but I don't want to be around this. I think I'll go do something else. I don't want to make stuff up, but you know, you're a data guy. You tell me.
We've absolutely heard this in terms of even looking at enrollment into our faculties of education. And we've been trying to diversify, you know, our classrooms because, you know, education has predominantly been female and white and hasn't been reflective of the diversity we see, you know, in those seats in our classrooms. So with COVID on top of things and stress and burnout and even what's happening in New Brunswick and Saskatchewan, fundamentally, that legislation shows a deep distrust of teachers, right? Teachers are professionals. Teachers always have the best interests of their students in mind. And in fact, they're legally required to do so. And so they're not hiding secrets from parents, right? They are trying to support these young people to get to a place where they feel comfortable and confident to be able to have these conversations, with their parents. And sometimes that will be teachers who are supporting them through their coming out process or their journey. So fundamentally, this is just not an attack on 2S LGBTQ young people, but it's an attack on the very tenets of public education and the teachers that we entrust and we charge with one of the most important jobs that we have in society. I think the most important job is being a good parent, number one. And then number two, we hope that we have great teachers, because next to the family, where do kids spend most of their time, right? It's in the schools.
So your job is being a great teacher. I want to ask you this as far as communicating one-on-one with a young person. What is it that a young person will find in a room with Dr. Chris Wells that he or she may not find in a room with a parent that's active in things like Million Man Marches? What is it that you have to offer?
Well, I've had the real privilege to work with thousands upon thousands of young people in my career. And the one message I always say to them is, you're normal and beautiful just the way you are. You don't need to change. It's society that needs to change. Because too often they've been told that they're disordered or they're a defect, or if I could just be like everyone else, then everything would be okay. Or if I could just pray harder, or I could try harder to change, right? You don't need to change. It's these hostile and discriminatory environments that you find yourself in that need to change. You're perfect and beautiful just the way you are.
So if every parent had that message for their young people, you're perfect and beautiful just the way you are, we might not be having this conversation.
It's the simplest and probably the most powerful thing any parent could ever say to their child, right? I love and support you, and I'm going to be here throughout your journey, no matter where that journey takes us.
Why did Chris Wells become a teacher?
Wow. I think it's partly because my mom was one of 11 in a farm family, and they farmed in the summer and they taught school in the winter. So you never escaped your homework, but you also learned the value of hard work and what it means to come together in community. But, I became a teacher, to help change my little part of the world, right? You think about the future of our society. And for me, it all starts with education.
How difficult was that for you, being a member of a farming community and being part of a group of people that tended to keep it in the closet, if you don't mind me putting it that way?
Yeah, it was hard, right? Because I had this interesting rural and urban experience. I'm raised by a single parent, and during the school year, I was here in Edmonton, and then the last day of school, I was shipped off on a plane, often by myself, to go to the farm for the summer. And in the farm community, you didn't even have a first name; you were just known by your last name. And so it took a lot to break through and break through that silence and that invisibility. But I think now we found nothing but support. And my big concern is for our LGBTQ young people, particularly who are living in rural or remote communities. You shouldn't have to leave your community to be able to find support, right? We want people to be able to stay and be accepted in their communities and build their lives, their hopes, their dreams. But too often, even here in Canada, I call it the MTV effect. If you were part of the LGBT community, you had to move to Montreal, Toronto, or Vancouver to be able to find a community that was out and visible that would support you.
Dr. Wells, is there any one story that you can offer us from the days down on the farm, as it were, in Western Canada, where you had a very difficult moment?
Oh, geez, many, many, many difficult moments, and I think of those thousands upon thousands of young people I've worked with, and the reality is, Charles, we weren't able to save them all, right? And I think about when I was a teenager, and I grew up in the 1980s. So the narrative I had as a gay kid, right? Well, if you were going to be gay, you were going to get AIDS and be dead by the time you were 30. Why would you ever come out to that? There was no hope. There was no future. I never saw one gay person who had a professional occupation or a job. I didn't even think it was possible to do that. Of course, you grew up in a province here in Alberta that didn't even have basic human rights protections on the grounds of sexual orientation until the Supreme Court of Canada forced the government to do that. 25 years ago, this year, actually, the Vreend decision came out in 1998. But I remember those kids, right? And I was thinking as a 15-year-old who had the razor blade at my own risk, wondering if I could make it, if I should go on, to think about, I made a different decision than some of those young people who taken their own life. And so what can we do to help to prevent that? How can we help to change that message and give young people, hope? It might be dark right now, but there is a community out there that cares about you deeply, that will welcome you, and there is a future for you.
I don't mean to probe, but part of my job is to do that in the interest of helping people to understand issues where they might not have the luxury and the privilege of being with people like yourself. So I've got to ask the question, and I'll ask it in this way. 15-year-old Kristopher Wells had a razor blade at his wrist. I'm presuming that it was your right hand that was holding the razor blade. Why?
Well, there was no hope, right? It was a dark world. There was nothing to hang on to. There was no visibility. There were no role models. The only messages you had were, you were going to live a life of deviancy, of trauma, of pain. And so you just wanted to make the pain go away. But thankfully, I didn't do that. And I did find that community of support. And I did come out. It took me to my last semester of my degree in university to do so. But, I say to kids today, if I woke up tomorrow and the world were queer, I'd be straight, because it meant something to see the world differently, to have that experience of going right against the grain. And when we think of great innovation, whether it's music or movies or entertainment or writing, the people often at the edge of that innovation are the ones who've seen the world quite differently.
Do you think it's difficult to say to straight people? Because I've tried this, and sometimes it connects, and frankly, sometimes it doesn't. Imagine a world where you don't feel loved by anybody, but you feel loathed by everybody. And if you could imagine that world, then you know the world that many LGBT people have been living in. Your take?
It's like a prison, right? In that world. And I take great pride that here in Canada, we've been changing that narrative. We've been creating a new world, a world full of hope and possibility. And that's why with these protests and these bans and these attacks on the LGBT community, sometimes it feels like that progress is moving backwards. But that reminds me that we just have to speak out louder, and we need more allies to join us, in this chorus of human rights, this chorus of diversity. I often say to teachers I work with to say, look outside your window. What you see is, the world's most diverse and resilient system. It's nature. When a system in nature reaches sameness, it dies and collapses because it can no longer adapt. This notion of diversity is built into the very essence and survival of our planet, and we ignore it as a species at our own peril.
You don't want to mention names, Chris, unless you want to, but let's just put it in terms of institutions, and it doesn't matter to me what walk of life we're talking about. Which institutions outside of the National Hockey League, clearly, are disappointing Dr. Wells today? Which institutions should be on the team playing ball with you?
Well, definitely schools, right? Schools are fundamental building blocks of our society. And so we wish that, if I could wave my magic wand, that every young person would be able to go to school and find support, be themselves, learn about each other, learn about our differences, not be afraid of our differences, but see them as a way to unite us in a common humanity. Healthcare is still a real challenge, particularly for our trans and non-binary young people, to be able to access gender affirming supports. And we see, right, that happening right now, particularly in the United States, where they're banning gender affirmative care, which is actually causing these young people considerable harm. In fact, it's causing some of them to take their own lives because, again, they see no hope for their future without being able to access these kinds of support. So something as small, even as using someone's correct pronouns, can make a whole world of difference to that individual. And it takes nothing away from you. But like we've talked about, Charles, it's just about basic common courtesy and respect. And that's a value I learned on the farm, right? Is when, people were hungry, you invited them into the dinner table. Didn't matter where they came from. Didn't matter if they were just passing by or they were, labor on the farm or they were guests, right? Everybody was taken care of.
I want to ask you, if you will, to privilege this podcast with a message to anyone listening to this who is alone, very, very alone, because of the issues that we've been dealing with. And I don't want to make this overly dramatic. I'm not suggesting that anyone who's like this is necessarily going for razor blades, but they're feeling harmed, and some definitely are thinking about self-harming. What's the teacher? You're the great teacher. What's your message to them right here, right now?
I call it the power of one. Every young person needs at least one trusted adult in their life that they can reach out to, that will be there to support them, not judge them. We hope that that's their parents. It could be a faith leader. It could be a coach in a community. Oftentimes, it's that trusted teacher in their school. And I tell young people, there's no issue too big or there's no issue too small. But if we don't know about it, we're not able to help you. And so it really comes down to building that trusting, relationship, to know that we're not going to out you when you're not ready to share that information with others, but that you have a space and a place where people are not just going to accept you, but they're going to love you and they're going to celebrate you. Because I don't know about you, Charles, but I've had enough of tolerance. I don't want to be tolerated anymore.
You have no idea how much I hate that term. Every time I hear it, it's like, well, you're much lower on the food chain than I am, but I'll tolerate you. I guess the message, if I had to sum it up in just a few words, is please, if you're in that position where you're feeling very alone, please explore every opportunity to find just one person. One person can make all the difference in the world. Share with that person. It'll change your life.
Absolutely. And, believe in yourself, right. As well, that, it's this great thing, right. In the world, I tell young people there is, you are a living work of art, right. And creativity. There is no one else like you. Be the best you possibly can be, because that means everything and it says everything. And for those kids maybe or parents who are struggling right now, reach out, right? Call the Kids Help Phone. They're a wonderful resource. Parents, there are PFLAG chapters all over this country of other parents who've been through similar journeys to yourself. As parents, often when kids come out, the parents go into the closet because they're afraid of what their family members are going to think, or their neighbors or their coworkers. So, you're not alone either. Right? None of us are alone in this, no matter what issue we're dealing with. But too often that's the reality, that we think we're the only ones that have felt this way, or that somehow that there is so much shame or stigma. But I think it all comes down to the fact to know that you are loved, you are worthy of love.
And the Kids Helpline is 1-800-668-6868. Kids Help phone number 1-800-668-6868. And if you haven't been able to take that down, but you need it, just Google Kids Help Phone. It's always there for you. Dr. Wells, thanks for always being there for me and for so many others.
Thank you, Charles, and for everything that you do, and the space for not only discussion, but hope that you bring into our world.
Dr. Kristopher Wells, the Canada Research Chair in Edmonton at MacEwan University, specializing in all studies related to LGBT youth. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, for telling friends, neighbors, children, aunts, uncles, it doesn't matter. Keep the gums flapping and keep telling people about the Charles Adler Show, now available on this podcast on any platform you go to for your podcasts. Thank you very much. I'm Charles.